Tēnei te rūrū te kaukau mai nei, ki hai mā whitiwhiti ki hai mā rakaraka. Te upoko nui o te rūrū te rekau, he pō, he ao, ka ao te hei mauri ora. Ka tangi te titi, ka tangi te kākā, ka tangi hoki koe. Nei rā te reo, o ngai te rua hiki hiki, o ngai te pahi, o ngā timoki, o tira nei rā te reo, o ngā hapu, te mana whenua, o Otago, e tangi nei, e tangi nei, e tangi nei. Nau mai, hara mai rā ki tēnei wāhi, hara mai rā ki tēnei wānanga, hara mai rā ki te kaupapa, e whakakotahi ai a tātou i tēnei o ngā pō, tēnei ka mihi. Tēnei hoki ka mihi, ngā taonga, tira ki ngā manu, ngā wai, ngā tipu, ka kōrero hia i tēnei pō. Me ngā whakaaro, me ngā mātāpono, e aki nei, tautoko nei, i ngā rautaki, te whakarauora, o tira ki te whakahoki, i ngā taonga ki tēnei wāhi, a tēnei ka mihi. So, greetings and welcome. Welcome to you all on behalf of the people of Te Rua Hiki Hiki, Moki, Taoka, Te Pahi, the sub-tribes of Te Runanga o Otago, who are mana whenua here. I welcome you all. I started off that mihi, that welcome, with a whakatauki or a saying, which talks about the cry of the titi and the cry of the kākā, and it likens that to the cry of the people. And it speaks about an intact ecosystem, and that us humans are a part of that as well. And so, yeah, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming. And my role really was to just open us up for tonight. I think I'm going to hand it over to our MC.
Kia ora, thank you so much, Tumai. I will get you back up for the panel discussion too. Your job's not done yet. Kia ora koutou, my name is Kimberly Collins. I work for Predator Free Dunedin, and I'm really, really happy to welcome you all tonight to the second in our winter speaker series. We've got some really exciting and interesting things to look at this evening, including Paul. So I'll start by saying that I remember Paul, my first job straight out of uni was at Zealandia in Wellington, and I remember Paul emailing me going, wow, look at this photo, it's a tiaki, a saddleback in the Pole Hill Reserve. Isn't this amazing? Isn't this cool? And I was like, yeah, this is so cool. And we were all like, this is amazing. And then as the years progressed, it became, look, there's tiaki breeding in this gully, and now I think it's overrun.
We're on our way. We still need to sort out those cats. But,
yes, always sorting out the cats. Should have been here last time. It's incredible to see how the biodiversity in Wellington has really flourished and come so far, and I'm really excited to hear from Paul tonight. So what we're going to do is start with a short presentation from Paul on the Capital Kiwi project in Wellington, what they've done so far in the reintroduction space, and then we're going to move into a panel discussion with some wonderful people from here at Ōtepoti Dunedin to talk about what the future might look like here for some of the taoka species that we may be able to see thriving in our city and in our backyards and in our forest areas. I will do some housekeeping quickly. So toilets, fire exits, you'll see them over there and over there. Thank you. Toilets are just through here to my right, and in the case of an emergency, just calmly remove yourself from the building and gather out here in the museum lawn area. There's tea and coffee at the back if you'd like to help yourself at any point, and there's also some water. So Without further ado, I think we should get stuck into it. Look, I'll do a better introduction of Paul, other than my silly anecdotes about getting excited about emails and photos of Tiaki. So Paul is the founder and project lead of the Capital Kiwi project. He grew up roaming Johnsonville's hills, where native wildlife was very rarely seen, and then coming home from an OE, doing an Oxford Masters and a Discovery Channel show in LA, and seeing kaka and karearea returning to Wellington's skies, he was inspired to help out. So Paul was the 2022 and 2018 Wellingtonian of the Year for Environment, and is also a 2024 Kiwi Bank New Zealander of the Year semi-finalist. I'm really excited to hear about how things are progressing with the Capital Kiwi project, and I'll hand over to Paul to update us all. So welcome, Paul.
Kia ora, I'll just talk to that. Yep. Kia ora Tumai, thanks for opening us. Mihi ana ki ngā iwi mana whenua o Ōtepoti. Mihi ana ki ngā manu, mihi ana ki ngā tohu o nehe o Ōtepoti. Ko Paul Ward toku noa, and as Kimberley was saying, I'm the founder and the project lead for the Capital Kiwi kaupapa, which in short is to restore kiwi, our symbol and taonga, and other taonga species to the hills of Manaaki. I'm tangata tiriti. I have 7 or 8 generations of Irish and Scottish and Danish ancestry. My Tiwai Ponamu connection is 4 generations of those were West Coasters, farmers, linesmen, and a mix from policemen to prostitutes and everything in between. But I grew up in Marsden and then moved to Johnsonville, north of Wellington, as a kid. And my experience of our manu, of native wildlife, was almost entirely absent from my backyard. It was blackbirds, sparrows, and possums at night. But the place that I grew up in, the old names were names that testified to abundance. There was Tarikaka, the place where kaka wait or rest, or the place where people trying to snare the kaka wait. There was Karori or Kaharori, the place of many snares. The ridge behind the Prime Minister's house is Paihuia, for the place where the huia used to sit. And there were all sorts of species, takahe, kōkako, moa back in the day. And even right up until the 1870s, you could go to the butcher in Thorndon in Wellington, and there's an advertisement we've got where you could get kaka and weka by the barrow load. So it wasn't just mahina kai for tangata whenua, it was a resource for all of us. And that abundance, we know this recipe, we know what's happened across Aotearoa over the next 150 years or so. By the time that I was growing up in Wellington in the 90s, most of that was gone. There was about 1% of the old ngāhere, of the old forest left in Wellington. If you want to get a snapshot of that, go to Ōtari when you visit. But mostly most of it's gone, and most of those bird species, like I go duck hunting with Dad as a kid, and for whatever reason I was into the manu. Like I go, oh, there's a miro or a karearea, and I get a kind of funny look from Dad, like shut up and concentrate. But for whatever reason, I had that bug as a kid, but for me, in order to experience those things, which are a part of our sense of belonging and identity as New Zealanders, as Kiwis, I had to go somewhere else. So I had to go to a place like Kapiti Island or Puriora, or I'd go with my uncle and granddad into places like the Tararuas. But even they were pretty quiet growing up. But it definitely wasn't in my backyard. And there was a famous description of Wellington as a basket case for our Indigenous biodiversity before the Zealandia fence was put up. And there was a survey that was done in the early 90s where across Wellington City they found 6 keruru and 30 tui. So those species were locally extinct and pretty much gone from our skies and hills. And I came back from overseas in the mid-2000s, and I remember seeing a kaka parrot. And it was the most disjunctive kind of, almost out of reality experience to see a kaka it was at the end of Aro Valley. It's like, where on earth did that bird come from? And it was just as those birds were starting to spill over the fence from Zealandia, where they'd been reintroduced. And so over probably 20, 25, 30 years in Wellington, there's been this kind of quite profound shift from pretty much nothing to having kaka, kārearea, kereru, tui, now back in our lives, so much so that my daughters, we were going for a walk the other day in the town belt, and my youngest said, "Oh, Dad, it's just a kaka." Like for me, it's so extraordinary. It was almost unbelievable. And if you're going back like a generation or two to some of those wildlife service and people who know the old stories, it would have been almost undreamable or unimaginable. And there's kind of three reasons for that shift. I mean, this is a whistle-stop tour through it, but one was Zealandia and the accident that it happened to be in Karori, like almost in the middle of Wellington City. So birds like kaka, which were gone for nearly a century, are able to establish in that space and then spill over the fence. Probably the unheralded story, which links in with all the good work that Predator Free Dunedin's doing, is the council, regional council and city council possum control. And that means for birds like tui, like kereru, like kaka, that food resource that was being smashed by the possum. So my in-laws grew up on the terrace in the 90s, and they describe having a pet possum, and no one could grow fruit trees in Wellington because of the amount of possums. So until Dunedin's probably beating us now in terms of this title, but for a long time, Wellington, out of any of our cities, definitely had the lowest population of possums out of our major urban centres. So that was the second part of the mix. And the third part over the last decade or so was this huge upsurge in community, iwi, landowner engagement in actively being guardians of these spaces. So doing things like running a trap line, restoring a ngahere has gone from something probably 12, 15 years ago that a dock ranger does or that a council ranger does somewhere else to something that's starting to become normalised as something that we do in our backyards, in our paddocks, and in the places where we live. And I got involved in a project in a gully at the end of Aro Valley, Waimapihi, and that started off with probably 3 or 4 of us to begin with, and we were trying to get to grips with, well, how might we look after some of these manu in the 21st century alongside people? And we got that grew incredibly fast. It brought in groups that traditionally hadn't done conservation, like mountain bikers, four-wheel drivers. One of the mixes, garage project, was the brewery just down the road, and one of the recipe was described as birds, bikes, and beer. And it meant that, I guess it was bringing in, one of our, philosophies was to be inclusive and to make the act of looking after that space one that was accessible to people. And whānau, kids, that space was reconnected with mana whenua, and that's a journey that's ongoing. And over the first 3 or 4 years of that project, it went from 3 or 4 of us to about 100 trappers, and it really, I guess it started to kind of mainstream in that community some of those acts of guardianship. But we were confronted, this was around 2015, 2016, with kind of the limits of what we were doing. So we had birds like tieki breeding, kaka did incredibly well. But what we were confronting was that there were little bits and pieces of good work being done across the city, but neither our manu, especially our wide-ranging manu like kereru, kārearea, the falcon, tui, kaka, kiwi, they don't respect property boundaries, and neither do the pests that threaten them. And so even in that 70-hectare space, we were probably, with that trapping net, we're only looking after a relatively tiny space in the centre of all that work. And so if we were going to look after some of these taonga back living alongside us, we had to do it at scale, and we had to figure out how to get the people that we needed to make that happen on board to do it. And so that was our iwi. our landowners and our communities. And one of the propositions was given how well kaka have done back in Manaaki. So they're not banning them anymore. There's around 350, 400 birds flying around the city. I was sitting outside a cafe on Ghuzney Street, and looking at all the nooks on this Chinese elm, which we call kaka graffiti, and it's the kaka sap feeding. So to imagine that at some point in the day or night that there'd been a kaka sitting on that is, gives me chills in my spine thinking about it. But it's kaka are one of those birds like Kiwi that as adults have a heap of things going for them. They'll take on a cat. They'll take on pretty much anything they want to, but they like the bush bogans that have returned back to town is one of the ways they've been described. And like Kiwi, kaka, the issue for them is in between as eggs and hatching and getting up to that weight where they can look after themselves. And so we were fortunate enough to have a couple of enablers who've been involved in this project. Paul Scratch Jansen, who some of you may be familiar with or have the misfortune of being associated with at DOC, and another guy, Darren Peters, whose nickname is I Hate to Wait. And early on, when we put out that trap network in that project, there was a project that had fallen over in Fiordland, and Darren had about, I think, 150 traps sitting in a garage, and he hated the idea that they were sitting in a garage. And we had a community of people that were keen to look after the tieki, to look after the kaka, and Darren said, just go and put them out. And this was council reserve, so I'm not encouraging this as like role modelling, but I remember when we had the meeting with council, they were, word had got out that these traps were out there, and the manager had said, all right, Paul, where are the traps now? And I said they were stored in a highly dispersed manner across Waimapihi. and then they said, all right, we'll get on with it. And I guess the kind of getting on with it was we're starting to see some of that, the benefits of that now, which is we're predator-free Wellington, we're capital Kiwi with Landcare is starting to become, these acts of guardianship of kaimanakitanga are starting to become normalised. So in that space, we asked Darren and Scratch, could we bring Kiwi back? And they were like, yep. I remember Scratch's answer, yep, why not? and it's basically with Kiwi, I'll see if I can do a whistle stop, 1 minute compression of Kiwi conservation. So actually there might be a picture of Anahira, here we go. You guys have got big Kiwi down here as well, so this probably won't be as exciting for you guys, but Anahira is 45 years old at least, so she's roughly my age. She has sired 60 chicks in her time. She was rescued from a pine forest at Te Wera in East Taranaki in 1980. And her current lover, Nouveau, is 7. I think she's just a fantastic example of these big fighting claws that Kiwi have. And you don't name you're not the hero of the Tane Mahuta story. You're not the symbol of our army and our rugby league team. They're not named after a piwaka waka or a tui. They're named after a tough, feisty animal that will defend its home. And we like to say in Manaaki that they've got a fend like Adi Savia. So Kiwi get a tick at that adult stage, especially the wahine, who can get up to kind of 3.5, nearly 4 kilos, some birds. And they get a tick at the egg stage. Their egg is too big for a rat or a stoat to open up their mouth. Like some of us who are old enough might remember the flip-top toothpaste ad. Those animals can't puncture that egg, and they'll also have, depending on the species, a mum or a dad sitting in that burrow defending that egg. So they get a tick at the egg stage and they get a tick at the adult stage. Where they get hammered is in between hatching and getting up to that fighting weight. And it took us a long time as people to work that out, because a Kiwi can also live for, we probably don't know how long Kiwi can live, but 50, 55 years plus. And so what was happening in lots of places around the country where we thought Kiwi were doing okay, like Bay of Plenty, the Northland, Taranaki, they were old birds. And Scratch talks about picking up a bird from Tauranga Girls Swimming Pool in the 1970s, so they were still around. But it was a bit like having an old growth forest with no saplings coming up underneath. So once those old birds died, there was nothing coming up underneath to replace it, and Kiwi were slowly heading towards extinction. So it wasn't until we got trail cameras and transmitters on the chicks that we started to understand or get to grips with the problem. And in areas with no pest control, up to 100% of Kiwi chicks will not make it to that fighting weight, and most of them will be eaten, and the number one perpetrator is the stoat. And so when we figured that out, it meant that there were a couple of strategies. One was called Operation Nest Egg, which is uplifting of the egg, incubating the egg and then raising those kiwi in predator-free environments until they return to the wild. And when we're talking uplifting and things, there's all sorts of issues from, it's very expensive, it's intensive, it works on a case-by-case basis. There's issues in terms of severing whakapapa of the manu, but it works in terms of our ambulance at the bottom of the cliff conservation. So the other method with kiwi is to do pest control in situ, so enough of those kiwi chicks are getting through to that adult weight, that fighting weight, where you can grow a thriving and healthy kiwi population. And we know that that's been done in small places around the country, like Whakatane went from 8 birds to over 300 birds over about a 15-year period. Whangarei heads went from, I think it was 80 birds to over 1,000 over a similar period. And so our proposition in 2017 was to do that in the backyard of our capital city across nearly 23,000 hectares. So the first conversations we had were with our mana whenua, and then with a couple of those big landowners. This is looking over Te Rāwhiti Station, which is about just under 5,000 hectares, and it's basically the southwest corner of the North Island. And then we went out into those communities, went out into the church halls, the village halls, got the bone-crushing handshake test from the farmers and the fishermen, and I'm ready to let go now if you are, but and went out there and proposed, would you like to have kiwi back on these hills? And of course the answer was yes. And then our duty really was, if kiwi could live on our hills, then should we bring kiwi back to the hills? And again, if anyone said no, and we probably want to leave and we'll take your passport off you before we kick you out. But the answer then was really just about getting on with that and doing it. And so over the next, this was 2018, the first traps went out, and this is beneath Pipanui Point on the west coast. This is a little bit out of date now, but over 100 landowners. We've removed over 1,000 stoats. We were one of the first predator-free projects funded alongside Predator-Free Dunedin and Hawke's Bay, Waiheke and Taranaki. And our sibling project is Predator-Free Wellington, who've been working on smashing the rats from Miramar and now heading into the city. So on that map, all those red lines, each one of those dots that make up those lines is a trap. So it's 4,600 mustelid traps, and it's one of the, it was anyway at this point, hopefully it gets beaten. That's the great thing about doing this stuff is hopefully we're uplifting the game for everyone, but at that point it was the largest intensive trap network for stoats. All the yellow dots on that map, so the red dots are all checked by the capital Kiwi contractors, like Pete, Jeff, Rauri, and that was to give us, provide trust with landowners and really also provide trust in terms of the quality of that network. All the yellow dots are checked by Predator-Free Wellington groups, community groups like right down the bottom there, it's the four-wheel drivers are checking the traps on Te Kopaha above Red Rocks, Parifero. Right on the western edge there is the mountain bikers checking the traps at Makara Peak, who now have kiwi roaming around for their night rides, which some of the people might have seen in the news. And so it's really, I guess the important thing about this is it's a network of protection. And it's not just a network of traps, but a network of relationships that's enabled that to be established. So, and again, the three kind of po that the project stands on are our iwi, our communities and our landowners. And it's a bit like a tripod in that if you pull any one of those poles away, the thing falls over. So in the graphs on the right, we had to deliver for 3 years, we had to show that stoats were at a low enough level to to enable those Kiwi chicks to get up, and we smashed those targets. And then in late 2022, we were able to welcome the first birds, and Anahira is our queen, our matriarch. Anahira's angel, and this was something that I wasn't really prepared for at the time. I don't think anyone was who was there. We had 300 or 400 people behind Makara School under the canopy. There was the gifting iwi, Ngāti Hinewai from up in Maniapoto, our mana whenua in Wellington, Taranaki Whānui and Ngāti Toa. And we had all the Makara School kids, the farmers, the local community. And when Anahira was brought out, there was all this hubbub and noise, and it all just went deathly quiet. And you could have heard on the grass a pin drop, and it was almost as if she was like a Cleopatra or Princess Diana or something. And it was a really extraordinary moment. And I guess she's our leader. In November, she's going to be made the patron of Makara School, and there's a big royal portrait that's going to be. Her nouveau sitting on an egg at the moment, so she's still got it in her mid-40s. I guess probably the other thing worth pointing out is when we started this project, probably the norm for a dock translocation permit would have been like 10 birds, and we'll monitor the heck out of it. We might let you have a couple more in 5 years, but incremental growth. And what we were very lucky to coincide with is the fact that on our sanctuaries and on our islands, we've run out of space for even some of our most critically threatened birds. And with Kiwi, we were lucky enough to be able to offer a site where some of those sanctuaries, Mangatotu, Rotakari and Taranaki, we were able to relieve some of that carrying capacity pressure, which I think with Tara and others we can probably discuss when we have question time. So we've got a permit for 250 birds. And I guess it's a radical shift from intensive care or ambulance at the bottom of the cliff conservation to extensive care and figuring out how we can live alongside these taonga again in the 21st century. That's just reiterating those that the project is built on. Landowners community, iwi. This is some of the landscape, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with from down here and all over the country. It's, how would we euphemistically describe it? Heavily modified. It's, grey scrub, tauhinu, kānuka, manuka, gorse, Darwin's barberry. It's the kind of thing that cactus workwear is made to protect you against. But our Kiwi, they're adaptable manu. They'll live everywhere from the sand dunes to the snowline to in pine forests. They'll flip over cowpats for invert life and things. So one of the other things we had to do is, so as I mentioned in that conservation context for Kiwi, an adult Kiwi can pretty much fend off all comers barring dogs. And so one of the things we had to do was work with especially the Makara community and community of South Kauri around running Kiwi avoidance training. We've got 170 dogs, all the working dogs, all the pig dogs have been put through, and the vast bulk of the community dogs. And again, I think it's the value of the depth of those relationships that, my great grandparents are buried out in Makara. My mother was a school teacher. Her first posting was at Makara School. They're places where, the importance, I guess, of those local and community connections meant that when we were coming out and socialising this project, like if we'd turned up in a dock uniform or even a council uniform, some of those landowners would have told us the gate wouldn't have been opened. And it will get more complicated as Kiwi edge onto the city. And there's 1,000 dogs in Karori alone, so I think the feasibility of providing avoidance training for those dogs is just it's not realistic. So behaviour change will be part of. Let's just say those Kiwi have a higher risk profile than the ones further out west. And that's the guts of it really is bringing home something that has been. A part of that whenua and a part of that landscape for a very, very long time. And I don't know if people know this about Kiwis, but they dig their own burrows. They can be like a metre and a half deep into the ground. And to think that there are 140 birds out there in those burrows at night. They're filled with, our burrows seem to be filled with cave weta. We're not sure if it's entirely symbiotic. I think sometimes they're dining in rather than going out. But it's it's been a project that has not been without its challenges, but we're extremely stoked to be where we are right now, which is returning a call and a presence and a taonga to those hills. I'm just going to play a little video if I get this right. Yeah, sweet.
Ngā kaipanei anō huhi a Ngāti Manu Wharanui, me tō rātou holonga mutunga kore ki wēnei manu huna tāne. Nā runga I te mea, o etahi o ngā tūpuna o wēnei Kiwi, I aru mai rātou, mai roto I ngā ngahere o Ngāti Manu.
From whakatāne to Wainui Amata, we know that Kiwi and people can live alongside each other if we take the care. And what today represents is a community getting on with taking that care at scale and at pace.
And so now, absent for well over a century, Kiwi are going to roam the hills of Wellington again. If kept safe, these manu should live 50, 60 years. They'll lay hundreds of eggs in their lifetime, and they are the beginning of what will become a huge, thriving population out there. So let's give them the chance to do that.
Ki nā tūrā, ko te kawa nui, ko te kawa roa, ko te kawa tige tige, ko te kawa tuatahi, ko te kawa tigi tigi o ngā rangi ki ai o matua nui, kia mau te tika, kia mau te pono, kia mau te awa.
Can you go 9829? Is going to get transmitter 13.
Nature is here, you know, we're a part of nature, and this is just another level in terms of reconnecting people to taiao, reconnecting to those things that previously had been lost. So, unreal.
So wicked.
That's my youngest daughter.
Yeah, we can let it go. Nice job.
That's a love song going on there. So the old fella that you saw in that video, I love Rory's quote, and that pretty much sums up the whole reason for doing anything we do, I think. But the old fella in that video, Ted, was 91 when the project started, and he used to ring us up. I think when you get to a certain age, you lose any shame. But and he'd say, when are the Kiwi coming? And he kind of gave us our KPI, which was if we can't look after the animal that's gifted us so much in terms of our name and our identity, we deserve to be renamed idiots. And now he rings us up. He's in a home now. He's 96, but when we sat down to think, shit, are these birds coming? Are we hitting all our targets? And is Ted still alive? Now he rings up and hassles Jeff about if we can go and take him out to see the chicks out there. So we have of the birds we've been monitoring, we haven't lost any birds in the 2 years since they've been out there. We had our first chicks hatch in December last year, and they made the front page of the New York Times, which was kind of surreal. And they've now got through to that stoke-proof weight where they've had their transmitters chopped off and they're out there. We don't know where they're living their wild lives on the hills. So it's an honour to be here to share with people who are doing this work in this place, and looking forward to the panel. So kia ora. Sweet.
Kia ora, Paul. That brings tears to your eyes, really, doesn't it? Seeing what's possible and what's actually happening in our beautiful capital city. I'd like to welcome our panelists up to the stage now. If you'd like to come and have a seat, that would be wonderful. So tonight, we have the wonderful Tumai Cassidy here from Te Runaka o Ōtakou. And we have got Phil Seddon from the University of Otago and Joe Carpenter from Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research. We've also got Taylor Davies-Colley down the end there. And yeah, I'm really excited to get stuck into some of these questions. Now, I'm going to ask Jacinta to be our microphone runner. Yeah, yay, Jacinta. And I'm actually going to awkwardly stand here because I think we've only got 3 microphones, so I hope that's all right. There's one here, actually. So why don't we start, if you could all just quickly give us a quick introduction of your name, where you're from, and also perhaps what species you would love to see reintroduced to Ōtepoti Dunedin.
Kia ora. Kia ora again. My name is Tumai. From here. I think that's a really hard question.
Yeah.
I think every species should return eventually. Realistically, the ones that we can do, but...
Kia ora. I'm not from here, so it's not my right to say, but if... personally, often I get asked, like, Kiwi's not actually my favourite bird, it's probably the kōkako. So I'd love, but that's, as Tumai was saying, there's a lot more challenges with bringing a bird like that back. But if we could, it would mean we'd be doing a lot of things right. So, yeah.
Kia ora, Phil Seddon. I'm at the university here. I'm a reintroduction biologist. I'm kind of interested in the idea of bringing things back and trying to establish new populations. I don't really have a favourite. I think Kiwi would be awesome. Takueka in a town bell would be amazing. I do have a soft spot for, seabirds, not tree birds, so maybe that.
Kia ora, I'm Jo. I'm a conservation ecologist at Manaaki Whenua, and I'm going to give a controversial response and say weka, which I know has always got, yeah, there's always mixed opinions, but I'd love them to come back to the east again.
Yeah, kia ora koutou, ko Taylor ho. Taylor Davies-Colley, I'm from Orokonui Ecosanctuary. A bit of a translocation myself from Te Tai Tokoro up north to Ōtepoti here. I think, my background's as a botanist, and we don't really do plant translocations, we just tend to call that gardening. But I think, as well, I would really love to see us, great that we really love to translocate our birds, but it'd be cool as well if we thought more about our smaller things. So it'd be great to get something like he moko moko a tohu, the tohu gecko down here, or even to think about maybe bringing a giant weta species to Ōtepoti, because they're pretty neat.
Yeah. So, as a reintroduction biologist, Phil, could you give us a bit of an idea as to what would have been here in Ōtepoti prior to people coming and bringing in their pests and all of their destruction? Because I feel like that would be a really nice way to paint a picture of what could be.
Okay, I'm going to go back to seabirds, because we were a seabird nation once. This
Yes.
land was covered in them, and we're seeing these little patches and remnants. And we think about how much that land must have changed. Seabirds were like a conveyor belt of oceanic nutrients onto the land. We've kind of lost all that. We see that titi, sooty shearwater, are hanging on in places where there's good trapping, and titi wainui, the fairy prawn. Graham's here somewhere, so thank you, Graham, for that. And I think there's the scope for a number of other petrels and shearwater that we could bring back here. We know that the land would have been filled with kaka. We see species that hang on that are these kind of urban adapters. So we see tui and koramako and piwakawaka and kereru hanging on. They can cope with a bit of predation, but we've lost the things that would have been really sensitive to having any predators around, like tiaki, saddleback. So if we could kind of work towards bringing those back. I love Taylor's point too, that we've got to think about the small stuff. There's this taxonomic bias, and we tend to focus on these kind of vertebrates. But we think, go down to smaller vertebrates, certainly the reptiles, frogs maybe, think about frogs back here. But invertebrates, because they're the little stuff that really rules the world, it drives the world, and if we're interested in kind of ecosystem level change, we should be thinking about them, even the soil microbes.
Tuma, I'm interested if you have any thoughts as to what role reintroduction plays for Te Runaka, and I guess what species would be important or what ecosystems would be important for mana whenua in Ōtepoti.
Yep. I think when it comes to reintroduction, there is a lot that could be learned, from some of the experiences and knowledge that our local Indigenous people have gained through lived experience with some of these, we say taonga, some of these animals. And I don't think we could really ever pin it down to just one thing. I think the more we can get back, the more we can have a better understanding about our place. And I think what's been missing from, as we talk about reintroduction of species to a place, we actually have to reintroduce ourselves to that species as well. And so the way in which, hearing some of the kōrero from Paul about communities having to change their behaviour around dog ownership, those kinds of things, I see that as being more of a challenge than actually establishing the species, getting them back. Actually, we have to change how we interact and how we live in our place, because or in my culture anyway, humans are the younger sibling, and the birds and the plants and the other creatures, they are the older sibling. And, from our experiences, we made mistakes and we let things go. And so, like with the moa and those other birds that are no longer with us, quickly forced us to actually change the way in which we interact with those species. And so that knowledge around how you not only interact with them, but how you maintain them over a long period of time. Those would be some of the key things I would like to see implemented when it comes to reintroduction. And I think for our runanga, like what Joe was talking about with the weka, actually every species has a role, and they all evolved together, and so we can't favour one species over another. Just because the Kiwi is a national icon doesn't mean to say we can't introduce other things, even things like weka or kārearea, who will impact things like Kiwi. They all have a role to play, and it's our job to actually fix that balance.
Yeah, just to be clear, I'm not like, it's Kiwi or nothing else. In some ways, what we've, on that map there, about 80% of the project area is privately owned land. So it's not a dock estate, it's not a regional park. And so sometimes we describe Kiwi as like a Trojan manu or a Trojan bird that's enabling us to start to have conversations about seabirds, about restoring other species to that environment. And so Kiwi they're almost apolitical, like whether you're red, blue, purple, green, everyone can it's one thing that we can agree that that we should look after. If we're gone out there, even talking about kaka, let alone a frog or an orchid, we wouldn't have been able to have that conversation. And so, yeah, it's all about getting to the same goal, I suppose, in the end, which is a restored taia.
Zealandia has obviously played a big role in Wellington. Taylor, I wonder if you could maybe give us an idea of what's happening with Orokonui and what species you're seeing come out from the sanctuary, and also, I guess, what some of the challenges are that they are facing beyond the fence and what's being done to combat them.
Yeah, I think, Orokonui has been really lucky to be, I guess, the arrival point for a lot of species returning to Ōtepoti, but also as a bit of a safety net for the species that are right on the brink. So since 2008, when kaka were first brought back to Ōtepoti, through to the reintroductions of things like moko kakariki to the Northern Harbour, to bringing kakaruai in from the Silver Peaks, Orokonui has played a big role in being that safe site. And I think going forward, it'll continue to be that place where translocations aren't actually made to Orokonui, they're made to Ōtepoti and they're made to Otago, but Orokonui and these sanctuaries play a really vital role of providing that safe landing ground. And I think we have seen a lot of success in terms of within the sanctuary, things like kakaruai are just dripping off the trees. And this is great. And things like kaka are really successfully breeding. Moko kakariki are on so many of the trees, and it's fantastic. But I guess the next step is that Orokonui is, tautoko what Paul said about his reserve, it's just one place. Orokonui is 307 hectares, and that's a phenomenal safe place for our wildlife. But for any of these translocations that we've made, none of them will be ever truly successful until those species are able to live across the city, because it's just too small a place, and while it's 307 hectares, that's still a very vulnerable location. All of our eggs are in one basket. Excuse the pun there, but if something was to happen to Orokonui, like a big fire, we would lose the entirety of the East Coast population of kaka potentially. So that is the real risk. So until we can secure those species on the outside, whether that be through community trapping, and the works of Ōtepoti Dunedin have been fantastic in kind of allowing those species to start that journey, we won't see any of these translocations being truly successful in the long run.
Joe, following on from that, I'm interested to understand if you had any ideas around what we need to see species and ecosystems thrive across Ōtepoti Dunedin. Is there any research into some, fundamental challenges that we need to overcome? And could you maybe speak to what some of those are and what we can do as a community to solve them?
I'm going to take up the rest of the time that we've got.
It's a big question.
I think if we think maybe more specifically about reintroduction, one of the biggest issues we have, obviously we think a lot about predator control, predator levels that are sufficient to enable species to thrive. And Paul gave a really nice example of that with the Kiwi, the 5% stoat tracking. You know, a huge amount of research has gone into understanding what those thresholds are, and that really allows us to, I guess, spearhead the kind of pest control we do and know what outcomes we really need to enable kakaruai to expand beyond Orokonui or other species. And some of those species are so sensitive, like tieke, we know it's almost less than 5% rat tracking. It's almost nothing that they can kind of withstand in the habitat, whereas, like Phil mentioned, with other species, they're much more resilient and robust. And another factor that plays into that is really habitat quality, because when we have better vegetation types, more kai in the landscape, that can also allow our species to actually have better breeding rates. I think a great example of that here in Ōtepoti that I really like to see is how often we see kiriru doing display flights for breeding. Hamilton doesn't have any kiriru doing display flights. They occasionally see kiriru, but they're not breeding in that landscape because it just doesn't have the kai for them. So I think to some level we're actually quite lucky in Ōtepoti that we do have some really diverse forest types still. We have this beautiful podocarp cedar forest around Mount Cargill, and that's all connected to Orokonui as well, so it allows that direct spillover through the habitats. You know, birds can leave Orokonui and immediately have quite good habitat nearby, and that's actually a luxury that many fenced eco-sanctuaries don't have. Some of them are incredibly isolated within farmland landscapes, so it's kind of immediately almost an island, but Orokonui is this ark really that also has lifeboats right beside it. So yeah, there's a lot more I could say, but I'll stop there.
I'm sure. And Paul, you mentioned that the possum control in Wellington was a really big part of bringing some of the native birds back because of that kai being available to them.
Yeah, we become rightly fixated on the threat of predators, but that habitat mix is critical, and sometimes it will come from surprising places in modified ways. Like one of the reasons that kiriru have come back in Wellington in a big way is all the fruit trees that were planted after World War II. So you've got cycles of very different to their natural supply, but that are enabling a population to gain a foothold. It's and yes, some of these solutions will be very different to what were the traditional Ngāhere environment that they were in.
Phil, following on from Joe's talk of this spillover effect and the fact that there's beautiful habitat right outside, do you think there's a really clear pathway or a sort of wild link for Dunedin where we could actually start to see those species moving through to the city? I know when we kicked off City Sanctuary, we joked, said, kaka and the octagon, woof, imagine that. But actually, is that something that we could see as a reality?
Yeah, we've got a really good leg up in Dunedin. It's a very green city, and a lot of that green space is embedded in neighbourhoods. 36% of the city is green space that's owned by private and gardens and things like that. And just to follow on from what Joe and Paul were saying, there will be species where you need really good-looking, intact habitat that you look at it and you go, that's great, that we'd understand that these species would live in there. I think we need to open our minds a bit to other species that will be much more adaptable and plastic in their choice in habitat. I always think of things like in North America, peregrine falcons, living right in the city, nesting on office buildings and eating pigeons. As far as the peregrine's concerned, they're on a cliff edge. They've got everything they need in there. A project I looked at was in the toki, the Japanese crested ibis in Japan, which are living in paddy rice fields. If you control the use of pesticides and you manage it in more traditional ways, that's a stream or a swamp for those guys. So we could think about other kinds of species that would exist in other kinds of habitat. Patiki in the Avon, and Ophir.
Just to testify to that, one of the species that's jumped over the fence from Landcare is Patiki, and where they hung on in Brooklyn, one of our, suburbia, a blackberry patch there was Pātiki breeding there for about 6 or 7 years. Incredibly dense blackberry, enough water running down in there so a novel environment, but a place for it to sit in the 21st century. Yeah.
Yeah, so keep the bush patches and make the greenbelt as good as you can and keep the parks as good as you can, but other species will use modified habitats and, they'll find the right kind of food sources and things out there. Just keep a green city, whatever that looks like, and then fill it full of things that should be there.
Yeah, I mean, as you all leave this evening, you might see an example of that out on the museum lawn here. I think, Taylor, you were the one that pointed this out to me initially a few years ago, but the trees out there are just laden with mistletoe. Up in the canopies, the tree can be bare, and there's this beautiful glossy green mistletoe, and my neighbour in Anderson Bay goes, "Oh, that bloody mistletoe, it's killing all my beautiful trees." But actually, this is that thing coming back to community and understanding what it looks like to have a healthy taiao and to have a healthy ecosystem. It's just so important for everyone to sort of recognise that really cool plant is actually a really cool plant and not just killing the introduced
It's not uncomplicated either. I remember one time spending a few hours with a tieki and watching it feed very happily on the berries of Darwin's barberry, which is now taking over some of the hillsides in the city. And so I was watching, and similarly coming across a tieki that had been predated by a kārearea, like classic, pillowcase white with the feathers everywhere. And there's one threatened species being eaten by another threatened species, but they're both back on the hills.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Tumai, I'm interested in your thoughts with regards to the role that these native species may play for mana whenua, but also for our communities more widely in the context of mahinga kai. I think it's a really important thing to consider. Conservation is historically a very Western idea of bringing birds back and bringing nature back for enjoyment, but yeah, keen to hear your thoughts on that.
I think when we start to talk about mahinga kai, the term taonga species, if we break the whakapapa of that term down, then it kind of explains that mahinga kai side of things. So I mentioned earlier before around the environment and the species being our elder sibling and us sitting below them. And so they are, in all facets of our culture, they are actually, their abundance is prioritised over human health. Because our health and the way we see it is reliant and it is tied to the health of the species and the environment in which we live in. And so that term taonga species, I think it gets thrown around. There's a lot of Māori words that just get thrown around, but people don't quite fully understand, what they're actually throwing around. And so that word, taonga, something that you value, but in the contract that we have with the Crown, that term is used around the authority that iwi Māori have over things they value. And so that term speaks to the value that was placed on the things that sustained our lives. And so mahinga kai is that practice of sustaining yourself from your environment. And so when we think about what do we sustain ourselves with today? And over the past 150 years, it's been sheep, cattle, and the native species have been put on the bottom and humans have been put on the top. And so mahinga kai is your ability to maintain the abundance of your place, so much so that your abundance comes literally from the abundance of that, those, what we say, taonga, resources, whatever you call it. So mahinga kai, and when you think about who here has eaten a mutton bird, So mutton birds in New Zealand, or for ngaitahu for the South Island, they are only harvested on a few islands of the south of Rakiura. And when we look at conservation, those islands have only ever been managed and maintained by the families who have certain bloodlines which gives them the right to go down to those islands. And they have, because the priority for their sustenance has been those native species, the health and the integrity of those ecosystems on those islands are much better than anywhere else that I know of, including some of our eco-sanctuaries. And even when we think about pest control, predator-free, those kinds of movements or concepts, those have existed for a long time amongst our people, particularly those TT islands. Some of those islands have been, they've always been predator-free because of the knowledge and those values that those certain families within our tribe hold around the protection, not only of their place, but of their species as well. And so, mahinga kai, it also speaks to how you maintain and manage your abundance. And so, we think, killing and eating things sounds bad. However, our environments are quite changed from the time that humans, since the time humans have first arrived. And we have changed the environment. And so we actually have a role as well. And mahinga kai, if you think about it this way, if you can harvest a certain percentage of a healthy population, right? Say it's 10% of the total population, or if it's 10% of the juveniles, pre-breeding, then the rest of that the rest of the 90% of that population has 10% more food. So if you scale that up in a sustainable way, and you take 20% or 30% of that, juvenile population, the rest of the adults have 30 or 40% more food. So they actually become more fertile. They can produce more eggs. And if you do it, right, it actually has a positive impact rather than a negative, which sounds quite counterintuitive. But if you actually look at it and break it down, it makes sense. And so, I think that's how mahinga kai needs to be approached, rather than, the classic rhetoric that the Maoris want to eat and kill everything, which just, if you actually look at the facts and you look at the track record, mahinga kai really speaks for itself.
Yeah. Phil?
Kia ora, Tumai. As you were speaking, it made me think of a couple of things. In sort of planning speak, we talk about milestones and KPIs, these key performance indicators, whatever. We always wonder when we're successful. But boy, what a measure of success if you've got the abundance that you can sustain humans on as well. I think the other measure of success, and we see it a bit in Wellington with things like kaka, is when your target species becomes a pest. I think that's a plus as well.
Yeah, well, some of those people who couldn't grow fruit trees because of possums now are having trouble with kaka.
Yeah.
Better quality of pests to have, I reckon.
I do remember when I worked at Zealandia, a low-level tension at some of the local functions between Zealandia and the Botanic Garden staff. I've got some beautiful trees that were being graffitied.
Well, the kaka are just like
lot.
re-indigenising the Manahiri there.
Yeah. I'd love to open up the floor to some questions. Does anyone have something they'd like to ask the panel? I think we have time for a couple. Tahu?
Kia ora koutou. Hanui kia koutou. Mana whenua o te rongo nei. I just wondered if you'd like to learn a song. We could have the questions and all that first. But then I thought, because I'm always here for the inner child, the child within, obviously, and I'm very lucky to have worked with the child within for the last 20 years since I was 7 or something. I thought if you'd like to learn a wee song, we could after we've had the questions. I can tell you all want to, don't you, Taylor? Yes, have you.
That sounds lovely. Perhaps we'll have some questions first, and then we can come back to our inner child.
Kia ora, ko Alison Cree, toko koa. Phil, you asked about key performance indicators, and one might be to think about rather than, or as well as, reintroducing individual species, to think about re-establishing ecosystems that are dominated by native species, and that includes thinking about the food webs of which they are part. And with that in mind, and thinking about beyond birds to the small that Taylor mentioned, and thinking about Tumai's words about ensuring that everything has its place in a restored ecosystem. What are the thoughts of panelists on order and timing, and as part of that, thinking about the fact that currently we don't yet have the tools to suppress the impacts of all introduced predators on some of our smallest and most vulnerable native species. Kia ora.
Taylor?
Kia ora, Alison. I think I don't know if I'm answering the question exactly how you put it, but I have a lot of thoughts around timing in terms of, I often think we get really caught up in trying to be ready for a translocated species, and that we get, and I assume it's what it's like to be a parent in some way. People probably really stress when it's coming, and then when it's there, you just kind of have to. And I often think that there's a little bit of that with translocated species in the community, and what we're doing, and that there is kind of you can try and prepare, or you can have it there and you just have to do. And I feel like with some species, we probably, in terms of the tough community challenges that have been mentioned, for a lot of people, they have no connection to, they have no understanding of what it might be like to have a kaka in their backyard, or to have a kiwi calling over the fence. And it won't be until they have those moments, those magic moments, like Paul talked about when he first returned back to Pōneke, where he saw the kaka in the tree, that we'll see people be ready. That's my comments on timing. But if anyone wants to actually answer Alison's question.
Well, I'll just picking up on that, I think when probably 2011, 2012, where we started to get to grips with the challenges of, a species like te eke outside the protection of the fence. Like some species like hihi, we still don't understand inside a fence or on an island. We had that first te eke nest outside the fence was, but they were gone before the huia was gone from the mainland. They're that vulnerable, and there were two chicks. One of them disappeared after 6 weeks. The other one lost its tail feathers, so classic sign of cat predation. But the other one made it through the next, I think, 70 days or something to fledge and be independent. And it was a single proof of concept. It was like, if you can do this once, what does it take to do it more than once, and what will be required? And some of those are very challenging. We had early on someone ring up from Holloway Road, which goes right up the middle of Waimapi. He follows where the old awa used to be, and which is now buried. And a landowner rang up and said, "My cat's brought in a really funny-looking blackbird." And and the funny-looking blackbird was a te eke, and there's less than 1,000 of these manu left. And we also had a student flat in nearby Norway Street saying, "I've got a care living in my roof," and it was kaka. But both of those things testify to the kind of severed connection that we have with these animals. And I think we knew from very early on that one of our challenges was not just doing the pest control or having the restoration plan. It was reknitting those connections with those animals. And I think that's as much a part of what we have to do as getting your rat, stoat, possum numbers down to those required levels.
I was going to not answer Alison as well, if that's okay. Just kind of follow on from it. I talked at the start about these kind of urban avoider species. There are urban adapters. There are urban avoiders. So there are species that are out there on the periphery of Ōtepoti. And if you make the conditions right, it's sort of build it and they'll come. And I think that might be the first stage. We could start to see that soon. We're seeing, I think, on the back of the fantastic predator control stuff that's happening, and you always say, what are we doing this for? We're starting to hear a dawn chorus in some areas. We're starting to see increases in numbers of tui and other species. Right on our periphery are totowai, robins. I mean, the kaka go one way out of Orokonui, but they don't come this way yet. So getting those things right and starting to see those things in there could start this kind of socialization. You get a more wild, we're rewilding the city, and you get people kind of more socialized to having these things around us. We got a taste of it during COVID, during the lockdown. Suddenly there wasn't all this other noise and disturbance, and people were going, oh wow, you know, what's that bird? I've not seen it in my garden before.
Yeah, it's an exciting
Has anyone answered the question?
Yeah. Joe, did you have any thoughts on Alison's question?
I was also not going to answer it, but
I'm sorry.
I was interested in what you said in the beginning, Alison, which I guess I think with considering reintroductions, they're about people do reintroductions, obviously, and people are driven by values, and so are reintroductions. And so I think that what you clarified initially, which was kind of what is our overall goal and our fundamental objective of reintroduction, and is it, you know, I really relate to what you said, which is that kind of idea of ecological integrity. We're bringing back the native species that used to be living in this area and the interactions between them. But I do acknowledge as well, because I think it's easy to forget that not everyone feels like that, and other people do have other fundamental objectives, which could also be about more, I guess, specific focused species conservation. That's something I come up against, I think, a fair bit as an advocate for weka. I really like weka, but I can understand that if you're trying to have a Kiwi creche, perhaps, or lizard restoration or invertebrates, then starting off a kind of ecosystem restoration with weka is not going to be a fantastic move. So, yeah, that was the only point I wanted to make. I understand that all these things have to be guided by our fundamental objectives that we actually have, and there'll be a time and a place then for different species.
Joe's kind of made the point I was going to make, is that you think about the relationships of animals. So you don't want to bring back things that are predators of other species that you're then trying to recover that would be at low density and then at vulnerable. So you don't want your seabird...
They've learned the hard way in lots of environments. You know, in Zealandia in the early days, they had weka and they had to remove the weka. On Carpenter, where they're trying to bring the seabirds back, they've also had to figure out how to remove the weka pressure in that context. But I'm a fan of weka also, but and Rari was a big fan.
In time. But Joe raised another really interesting point, and Alison mentioned it as well, this idea of kind of what are we doing this for? And it's not for any given species, just to Tumai's point. We're really thinking about kind of restoring an ecosystem that is stable and resilient. It's able to bounce back from change, and that it would be dominated by the species that should be there. But it won't, we're not turning the clock back. I think this is a misconception globally, and it's a conversation globally. Any kind of idea of restoration, you're picking an arbitrary point in the past and you're saying, we want to go back 100 years or 200 years or 500 years or before people or before something or other. It's impossible. Ecology, ecosystems are dynamic. They're changing all the time. There's a different set of organisms around at the moment. So we've got novel ecosystems that we just have to live with. We've got to think really what we want the natural world around us to look like, and think manage for that kind of holistic ecosystem health dominated by natives.
Yeah, if you want it to look like Beatrix Potter from like the 1850s and rabbits and stoats, and then we'll just stop doing stuff. And
Yeah. Speaking to the fact that we are talking about birds a lot, I actually had an interesting experience with my son in the garden the other day, where I realised the reason that we often focus on birds and megafauna is because we don't actually have time ourselves to stop and look and take in our environment. You know, I think actually, yes, we can do all this work to restore our nature and our taio and kind of create a holistic ecosystem approach to this work. But if we as individuals don't actually have the well-being in our own minds to stop and look and appreciate things like, I really like mosses and lichens and fungi. I just think they're so gorgeous. When you actually stop and look really closely for a while, it's therapeutic. We could put the councillors of Dunedin out of business if everyone just stopped and looked at the fungi.
I think that's a really, really good point, and I think it reflects on not just our ecosystems but also our conversations about translocations, is that it's really obvious when a kaka is missing. Like, it's really obvious whether there is a kaka there or not, but it's not obvious that there has been this insidious loss of tussock skinks through our city. You know, like, they are just disappearing neighbourhood by neighbourhood all the time, and you'll never notice. We don't notice that certain small plants are disappearing from our the banks along the pathways we walk. And I think for a lot of people, they can't recognise whether an ecosystem is happy and healthy or not, because we don't have those sorts of experiences. So, I think there is a huge amount of the role of these really noisy or charismatic ambassadors like Kiwi and Kaka to go out there, and people see it and turn up and they go, oh, that it's working because they've had this thing. But I think at the same time, that point you made about taking our time to actually look down, look at small things, appreciate what's there and what's missing. And stuff like invertebrate density and those things we don't notice about how much like people and the conversations they have about when they're a child and there was all these bugs that hit their car and now they don't, and they never think about the fact that is actually a reflection of the fact that in those ways our environment is still slipping backwards, but just in a really slow, small to see way.
Yeah. The end of my story with Wesley was that we were looking at one of the Anderson Bay tunnel-web spiders, amazingly cool creatures, and I got so fixated that he actually found a worm and ate it. So, I'm looking at the medium-sized bugs and he's actually just eating the smaller ones. So there's a place for them all. I think we have time for one more question from the audience if anyone had one. We've got one over here.
Hi, kia ora. How feasible is it, because Alison touched on this briefly, that we're going to have a predator-free New Zealand by 2020, 2050?
That's the last question.
Because, you mentioned cats, you had your cats there, and to me they're one of the biggest predators that we need to get rid of, and yet it's such a dodgy political subject. So I'd like to know your thoughts on where you stand on cats and hedgehogs and things like that.
Definitely stand on them.
Reece, you should answer this one.
I can start by saying I think that if anyone can do it, it's got to be New Zealand. We've got a track record internationally of an incredible amount of Kiwi ingenuity. You just look at what happened down on Campbell Island where they got rid of rats from this tiny little island in the middle of the subantarctics, and I just think with all the different sort of technologies and sort of research projects and learnings that we're getting from doing, that it's certainly possible. And hey, we might not get every single predator that's out there to begin with, but if we can at least sort of start with the ones that are going to be targeting our vulnerable native wildlife first, then that's a step in the right direction. I, on the record, do not like cats and do not like hedgehogs. I'll pass it on. If you could just state your position on cats and hedgehogs.
I think one of the things technology is moving really, really fast, and I guess our ingenuity is moving really fast, but so is the cultural shift in terms of people's care. We look at what's happened in Dunedin and in Wellington and across the country in terms of the exponential rise in wildlife in the last couple of years. But with that has come this incredible cultural shift of people caring. And I think if we look at Aotearoa right now, could this Aotearoa do it? Probably not. Could the Aotearoa of a few years' time, where there's so many more people who are so excited about the fact that, you know, that there are Kiwi running around the hills, that they're getting woken up at 5 a.m. by kaka, that, you know, that they are appreciating these things, that Aotearoa might be able to do it, you know? And I think that's what, you know, that's one of the things we have to think about is the country right now in the place where we can achieve that? Maybe not, but I think we're moving in that direction, and a lot of that mahi in terms of convincing the people is being done by the manu, by the moko, by all these amazing taongas that are out there.
For sure.
It's pretty much what I was going to say, but not as well. So thanks, Adam. I think aspiration goes a long way, and I think that's what Predator Free has done. It's engaged people to think about a possible other world that we could be in. Whether we get there or not, we're going to end up in someplace better than where we have been. And it's going to change those attitudes towards other things that aren't on that list at the moment. Things like hedgehogs, things like cats. We're seeing that conversation happen already. And I think the next few years will be interesting about people understanding you know, the impact of cats and different ways of managing them, the way people do overseas. So you can still have your household cat. It's just a different expectation. I was talking to someone earlier today and reminiscing that my wife, Yolanda Van Hazek, that's known to many of you, grew up in Dunedin, and they had backyard pets like ducks and things like that. She said every one of them was killed by someone's dog who would come onto their garden. And they would just go, oh, well, we'll get another duck. But can you imagine nowadays if you had a pet in your backyard that was killed by a dog? So those attitudes can change. So the same thing will happen, I think, with cats, where if you've got your bird feeder, and it's not, you just won't tolerate having seven cats using your backyard as a hunting ground. So aspiration, I think it's going to take us a long way.
Tumai, do you want to have a go?
I think I'll just support what everyone else has said around trying to at least answer that very difficult question. But I think I'll just go back and reiterate some of the things I'd already talked about around. We like to say that we value our species, but we may value looking at them, but when it comes to our sustenance and how we live, they aren't actually valued in the way in which we say they are valued. And so I think part of that, not only cultural shift, you actually need a major economic shift as well. And it's not just for reintroduction, it's, you know, climate change and the rest of those issues that we have. But I guess the contribution that mana whenua and Māori can have at place, and particularly when it comes to bringing these species back, is around that knowledge of, you know, where they used to be. Paul gave those great examples of those place names in Wellington, which reflect the abundance that formerly existed, and that is actually reflecting now that those species are returning. And so those are examples of, I guess, Māori knowledge that are actually a part of that story going forward. And I think it will be a major challenge for us, particularly in conservation, is how do we fund all of this? Because that's a major issue. And I think my mind goes back to the TT Islands, where they fund all of their, restoration, or actually they're mostly just maintaining what they've already got through those species. So those are some of the ideas I think we need to start thinking about as a nation going forward.
I guess through a Pākehā lens, like more in terms of KPIs and things like that, our pride in a lot of our Indigenous wildlife is a passive pride. Like we've just been through the Olympics where we're celebrating Go Kiwi and all that kind of stuff. And I think what shift is required, and these are steps towards that shift, is to shift that passive pride into active guardianship. And if I can reflect on one aspect of the predator-free movement, when those two Kiwi chicks ended up on that front page of the New York Times in December, there was the war in the Ukraine, the war in Gaza, and the Trump American election. And then there was this little picture of these two Kiwi chicks from the bottom of the world from a muddy Makara hillside, and LeBron James down the bottom, but it was clearly positioned as a story of hope in what are despairing and challenging times. And I have teenage daughters, and some of the challenges that they're facing can appear to be out of reach and out of our ability to do anything about them. So I think what the predator-free movement is doing and has done in many ways is provided us with some sense of agency with which we can actually control our future.
Taylor, I loved your analogy earlier about parenthood. I feel like it's similar with predator-free. We're like, we'll just figure it out as we go along. Did we need to buy specific socks to put on their hands to stop them from scratching themselves, or could we actually just put a pair of socks on their hands, you know? We just learn as we do, and if we don't try, then we don't learn, and then we don't do. I also really look forward to the day, Paul, when your daughters or children are walking through their local bush reserve and they go, oh, it's just a bloody Kiwi, Mum. And I really loved the point you made, Taylor, about that intergenerational sort of change in behaviour, and also, Tumai, the fact that this is going to take decades, this is going to take generations, this is going to take such a huge amount of time for us to achieve, and we're just one piece in that puzzle. So on that note, I will close off our panel discussion. I'd love if you could all join me in thanking our wonderful panellists tonight. I think it's been a wonderful conversation, so thank you. We are. We're just quickly going to... That's all right. The song is part of the gifting ceremony, I'm sure. We also just have some gifts to say thank you so much for your participation. Go and have a kai at Ajo and enjoy some Dunedin treats. All right. Oh, well, send us off with a quick waiata then. I see.
Now, can everyone hear me okay? Can you hear me at the back there? Oh, fantastic. So I'll just put myself here. It's the Ecosanctuary, not the Ego Sanctuary. Okay? So I just want to obviously thank you all for being born and bringing your unique skills and gifts into this world. I love being part of this world with you all. And something that I love is that this is a long term. So I'm quite relaxed now. I know I can just give what I can and it will carry on once I've returned to So, I got contracted obviously by Aroha Kaikarai Valley to do some training sessions with the little 3 and 4 year olds. And I thought, oh, yes. So we can talk about that cycle of life, and we can talk about how important it is that all life is perfect, all life is beautiful. No life deserves pain because they've been placed by us in an ecosystem that they didn't evolve with them. So we were celebrating humane. I think that's really important. So are you ready for a wee song? Are you ready? Normally we do it sitting down, but is that okay standing up? All right, you ready? You can sing it back to me. They go into the trap and the trap goes and they go back to the earth, no pain. They
Go into the trap and the trap goes snap, and they go to the earth, no pain. To the trap and the trap goes snap. To the trap and the truck goes slap. Go into the truck and the truck goes slap.
Are you ready for the next bit? They go back to the earth and they have a rebirth. They go back to the earth and they have a rebirth and they grow back into something new. They go back to the earth and they have a rebirth. And I'll ask Paul, as I'm the guest, what did they grow into, Paul?
Dog vomit slime mould.
Oh, I'll ask. Oh, yeah. I'll ask. Oh, sounds fun. Yeah. I'll ask Kimberly. Oh, yeah. Taylor. Oh. And the final word, please.
I'm old.